Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. We appreciate folks taking the time out of their busy schedules to participate in today's discussion. We titled our webinar, Setting a Fiduciary Framework, Best Practices and Plan Fees for Defined Contribution Plans. My name is Vin Smith. I'm a partner and consultant here at Fiducian Advisors, and I'll be the moderator for our discussion this afternoon. I'm joined by two of my colleagues, Carol McSherry and Steve Default. Allow me to do brief introductions for both folks. I suppose I'll start with Carol. Carol's also a consultant in our defined contribution practice and works directly with plan sponsors on governance and oversight, directly with plan administrators on operations and compliance, and also with participants on financial wellness. So thank you, Carol, for joining us this afternoon. We also have Steve Default. Steve is a practice leader within our defined contribution group, and in addition to working directly with clients like Carol, also helps to set the strategy and the vision for our team. So with that, over the next, we'll call it 30 minutes or so, you can see on the screen the agenda or topics we plan on discussing. And if folks have questions, please feel free to enter them into the chat box, and we will do our best to answer items as they come up. We'd like to keep this as conversational and as helpful as possible. So we'll start today's discussion with a brief overview of the fee landscape. So fee management has been a focus for our clients and our firm literally for 20 plus years or so, as it is a critical oversight responsibility for fiduciaries and plan sponsors. So in addition to being an important responsibility, it's also one of the most heavily scrutinized areas of plans. And from a plan sponsor perspective, the fee discussion has evolved and gotten quite complex over time. And our hope today is to make it simple for folks. And maybe I'll start with that by outlining, from our view anyways, what some of the key responsibilities are around fee management. So as a fiduciary, as a committee member, certainly want to be sure that you understand plan fees, document plan fees, benchmark those fees to determine reasonableness. And then also, again, as the marketplace changes, evaluate all the different models that you have available to you as a plan sponsor and determine the best fit for your program and for your participants. So as we move through the discussion, our hope will be to tie back a lot of the commentary to those key tenets. So hopefully with that bit of context, I'm going to ask Carol to provide a bit of an overview of ERISA fee litigation to illustrate just how heavily fees have been scrutinized over the last several years.
Sure. Thanks, Vin. So, I think it's a good way to highlight the importance of prudent fee management, to talk a little bit about the current trends in ERISA fee litigation and how these trends have evolved over time. So like you mentioned, plan fiduciaries have a duty to ensure that record keeping and investment management fees paid by the plan are necessary and reasonable. And in excessive fee claims, plan participants are essentially alleging that fiduciaries have failed to manage plan fees to that standard and have thus breached their fiduciary duties. So we saw these excessive fee cases really take off in 2006 or so, with a series of class action lawsuits filed by one law firm in particular, targeting the very large plan space to begin with. So 401k plans with $1 billion plus in assets and tens of thousands of participants. And originally, sponsors did have some success with initial dismissals, but over the next few years, plaintiffs' firms really became more, informed around the complexity of plan fees and record keepers' varying levels of ability around assessing plan fees, and at that point began to fine-tune their claims and strategies. We really started to see some very large, very publicized settlements made. Boeing and Lockheed Martin, for instance, settled cases for about $50 to $60 million, and more plaintiffs' firms started to join the mix. And then fast forward to 2016, a new wave of class action lawsuits were filed targeting 403B programs, primarily in the college and university space, some healthcare as well, with the same sorts of excessive fee claims being the focal point. But there were some unique traits of 403B plans that were also brought to light, like the impact on plan fees associated with the use of multi-vendor plan structures and annuity offerings that are just more commonplace in the 403B space. And then late as of late in 2020, we did see another uptick in cases filed, and we're seeing kind of a cookie cutter approach, if you will, to a lot of these cases, with a lot of the same language lifted from one complaint and directly applied to another almost verbatim. And over time, it's also become more evident that it's not just the $1 billion plus plans that are at risk, but some of these cases are being levied against sponsors of, even $100 million in plan assets or less, with even less than 1,000 participants.
And so, Carol, we're off to a good start. We already have a question in the chat box, so maybe before we move on, the spirit of it is to paraphrase is, do you have any sense as to why, as of late, there's been a bit of a spike in claims levied against plan sponsors?
Yeah, so we think it's for a variety of reasons. Certainly improved fee disclosure requirements imposed by the Department of Labor, both at the sponsor and the participant level, all in the best interest of participants, right? But also shining a light just on the complexities around plan fees and how difficult it can be to fully evaluate your current state and the different options available to you. And I think also just the media coverage around past substantial settlements making filing these types of cases pretty attractive. And with public documents like the Form 5500 filing, the annual audit report that's out there, it's really not very difficult for plaintiffs' firms to identify plans, to target. And perhaps the harder part is just finding a participant to serve as the named plaintiff, right? And get that class action suit going. But I'll also mention, in some cases, there is just a lack of a prudent oversight and documentation process in place to prove that a sponsor has fully evaluated both the level of fees being assessed to their plan, as well as how that assessment is being done, which at the end of the day is what's most important. In studying, some of the cases that have been dismissed in favor of plan sponsors, it's pretty clear that you don't need to have the lowest fee, but more, you just need to have proof of a prudent oversight and evaluation process in place.
Great, thanks, Carol.
And with that, we also wanted to take this opportunity to go over some of the most common issues raised in excess of fee cases. They'll probably sound familiar to most of the folks on the phone at this point, but first and foremost, investment fund fees, failing to use the least expensive or institutional share class of an investment option, or failure to use or at least to evaluate the use of separate account or collective trust vehicles versus mutual funds, primarily to plans in the larger space with access to that sort of offering where some cost saving on the investment expense side could perhaps be made. And of course, the conversation around active versus passive. In administrative and record keeping fields, failure to take your plan formally out to bid via an RFI or an RFP on some kind of regular basis to drive down record keeping fees in a competitive setting, or to at least to be benchmarking your plan fees on a regular basis and conducting negotiations with some degree of success. The conversation around per capita versus asset-based pricing is also a big one, with no cap in place on asset-based pricing. And I think Steve's going to talk a little bit more about that in more detail in a few minutes, as well as revenue sharing, not fully evaluating this method to offset plan expenses or permitting revenue share without implementing any caps or making any regular credits back to participants is needed. And I think these last two items have primarily been geared towards the tax exempt side. So, in the event a plan offers multiple record keepers, has a cost benefit analysis been conducted to quantify perhaps the premium that participants may be paying for not using the plan's economies of scale to drive down record keeping fees, to drive down investment fees in a single vendor construct? So going through that analysis is just increasingly important. And similarly, are there too many investment options in the menu? I'm cautious not to say a number, but say you have a plan with 100 investment options or 200 investment options, plans like that exist. And is that diluting the plan's ability to garner enough assets into any particular asset class or investment option to lower the investment expense or to gain access to a more cost-efficient vehicle? And maybe just to put a bow on it, when you dig into a lot of these allegations, a lot of this can be mitigated by having just a sound, comprehensive governance process around plan fees in place with proper documentation as to why certain decisions were made.
Thank you, Carol. So Steve, I think you know, and Carol articulated it well, there is a ton of focus on administrative fees from a variety of lenses. And over the years, I think we've all heard a fair amount from plan sponsors that the record keepers have done a pretty good job keeping the pricing model at least somewhat opaque. I think it would be helpful if you could share with the group, the best you can, some insights into the main factors that determine a plan's fee.
Great, thank you, Vin. As you alluded to the fact, there are quite a few factors that are taken into consideration when determining plan fees. Service providers typically start with an assessment of plan data and statistics. For example, number of participants in a plan, plan assets, cash flow, contributions, distributions, also participant demographics such as age, tenure, compensation. Once those items are looked at, then they look at the administrative components. For example, payroll processes, prevalence of loans and how those loans will be administered and processed. Plan design features such as automatic enrollment, auto deferral increase programs, and the administration of those programs. Participant education requirements such as the need for hard copy mailings versus electronic delivery of communications, any need for custom or integrated messaging related to a company's broader benefits packages. Really, as you can tell, there are quite a few factors that are evaluated and considered when determining the true cost to run a plan. But once this baseline cost is determined, if you look on the far right of that graphic, once this baseline is determined, there are periodically opportunities to reduce that fee by using certain services or investment products offered by that record keeper or custodian. So examples of that might be the utilization of managed account programs, proprietary investment products, HSA administration, college savings, or debt management services. So the addition or the use of those types of services by a provider could potentially reduce your record keeping fee. Now, it is important to untie or not have your investment menu be tied to your record keeping, but you certainly want to get value where value is. So if you are using some proprietary products, that should be taken into consideration when developing or determining your fee. So Vin, really to sum it up, there are quite a few factors that are considered in determining a fees. So we'll leave it there and see if you have any questions.
No, thank you, Steve. That was great. We're going to switch gears a little bit, as I think looking at the attendee list, many on the line know, and this is actually pretty good timing because we've also gotten some questions in the chat box. We do a pretty comprehensive fee benchmarking survey each year that looks at a variety of components of fees, but importantly, we do some work on trends within fee structures. And Carol, if you wouldn't mind spending just a couple of minutes on some of the trends, and then Steve, we're going to jump around the slides a little bit. I'm going to go back to you for some of the key considerations.
Yeah, sure. So you mentioned our survey, and just to give some of the stats, it does represent the fee activity for our more than 500 defined contribution clients, representing over 150 billion in assets and more than 1 million participants, also with exposure to 20 different record keepers, or more than that, I think. So a pretty broad survey that we're pretty proud of. And in terms of trends, certainly we continue to see fee compression throughout the marketplace. And over the last, call it 10 years, we've seen about a 35% reduction in average total plan fees across our plans. I think that's influenced by things like increased flow from actively managed funds to low-cost passive, a general decrease in investment expenses over time, increased use of collective investment trusts, like I kind of mentioned before, and certainly just fee compression within the record keeping space in particular, for all the reasons we described before. So improved fee disclosure requirements, increased RFP, RFI activity, just more scrutiny around planned fees in general, but also, improved efficiency of record keeping platforms as well.
I think maybe Carol, before you get beyond the compression and planned fees, I skipped one slide that I shouldn't have skipped, quite honestly, that I want to go back to Steve before we see what the outcome is, and just have Steve walk us quickly through the decision tree before I almost ruined the punchline on the trends, and I skipped right over you, Steve. Sorry.
That's all right, Vin. So let's talk about administrative fee considerations. It's ultimately a process that a plan sponsor should go through when evaluating and considering fees. So first is to think about the required fees by your record keeper. So again, all those factors we talked about that go into creating that fee, and how you want to structure that fee with your record keeper. So that can be done on a per participant basis, asset based, or a flat dollar. Once that's determined, then you turn to how do you want to pay that fee? Do you want to pay it as a plan sponsor, as a company? Do you want to assess it to participants, either pro rata, per capita? Or do you want to pay it through revenue sharing from the plan's investment options, or a combination thereof? Once those items are determined, then taking a look at the investment menu and the revenue sharing. Revenue sharing, just to set the playing field, revenue sharing is a component of a mutual fund's expense ratio that may be paid to a third party by that money manager. So again, it's incorporated into the investment expense ratio. Some funds have revenue sharing, some don't. But the key there is making sure that you know as a plan sponsor where revenue sharing exists and what you're going to do with that. The most prevalent model in the marketplace today, in new opportunities, new business opportunities, would be the concept of fee leveling, crediting any revenue sharing back to the individual participant invested in the fund that's generating that revenue sharing. However, there are still quite a few plans, and about 50% of our plan sponsors use revenue in other ways, such as use to pay eligible plan expenses through an ERISA bucket account, or to directly offset record keeping administration fees. So all of these pieces should be, thoughtfully considered and documented during your fiduciary processes.
All right, Steve, thank you. And let me move forward. All right, Carol. Now, if you could finish your trend slide, and I promise no more interruptions from me.
No, that's fine. In terms of the pricing model, like Steve was articulating before, that is an important trend that we've seen, a shift away from asset-based pricing in favor of per participant pricing over time. We do see there that about, 50% of it's almost close to a 50-50 or maybe closer to a 60-40 split at this point. But there's been a big change in that over recent years. We've seen that the percentage of our plans using per participant pricing has actually more than doubled over the last, maybe 5-6 years there. Perhaps not a huge surprise, but drilling a little deeper into that, it's mostly on the larger plan space, I think, where they've had the ability to drive that record keeping fee down to, south of $100 a year, something that's a little bit more palatable for participants to see on their statements, quarterly assessed, of course. So within that number of our plans that are using per participant pricing, for plans that are of 250 million in plan assets and above, they're about 75% of those are using per capita pricing at this point. And, Steve talked about administrative fee leveling. It's, again, that being a method via which plan sponsors can apply a consistent asset-based or participant fee to all participants in the plan, regardless of what specific investment options they've elected to invest in. So either all the investment options are offered via the lowest cost, zero revenue institutional share class, or any revenue share that is generated is credited back to participants to, some degree to accomplish that equitable and transparent distribution of fees. So you see there that more than 60% of our clients have implemented some form of fee leveling at this point, or as of the end of 2020 anyways, and we expect that trend to continue. But we also wanted to take this opportunity on the bottom right to bullet out a few of the newer initiatives or observations, perhaps, around plan fees that we've been, reviewing in recent years and that we've been focusing on more with our clients. So hybrid pricing models with increased record keeper flexibility around how they can assess different kinds of fee models. We're starting to see some more creative ways of assessing plan fees, like using an asset-based fee for accounts under some threshold and a per capita fee for accounts over that threshold. Also more cost sharing between plan sponsors and participants. So we're seeing some creative things there. We noted out of scope projects. So with the mass migration towards per head pricing, fee leveling, just fee fee compression in general impacting record keepers, it seems like we've gotten record keeping fees so low that we're kind of reintroducing the idea of a la carte plan pricing. So basic service agreements have gotten simplified, and some clients are running into more out of scope type projects that come with an extra project fee. So how does that factor in to the overall pricing structure? We've been taking a look at that. Maybe I'll bundle the next three together, evaluating things like transaction fees, managed account fees, and self-directed brokerage fees, including account maintenance fees, trading fees, or revenue generated from investment options, proprietary investment options available through the brokerage window. So how does that affect the overall relationship pricing? We're spending a lot of time trying to quantify that for clients to benchmark and negotiate where possible, just to kind of get ahead of things. And I'll wrap up with the final initiative we've been working on for our clients who have implemented administrative fee leveling, evaluating their plans for whether there's an opportunity to reduce the net investment cost for participants via revenue credits, if that's available.
And Carol, before we jump to the next slide, we've had a couple folks ask in the chat box, can you give a couple examples of what an out of scope project might be?
Yeah, so I think most recently, clients have been surprised to hear that maybe within their service agreement, they're only permitted one fund change project a year. So they've received an outside billable perhaps for simply trying to reduce the share class on a couple of funds throughout their menu within a calendar year. So they kind of have to weigh, okay, the cost of this project, is that wiping out, if I'm going to pay it from, say an ERISA budget within the plan, so ultimately borne by participants, am I going to wipe out any potential investment savings just to get this project through? So we've had to do some analysis around that. And then another big one was around updating feedback files and such to accommodate adding a new contribution source to the plan, like Roth or voluntary after tax or something like that. So we find ourselves just really scrutinizing service agreements lately to try and get ahead of some of the items that, strategically we're trying to work on with clients in a given year, or how that might impact budgets or just the overall client service relationship.
Great, thanks, Carol. One of the topics we definitely wanted to cover this afternoon, and Carol mentioned it, lowest net cost investment fees. Say that 3 times fast. Steve, if you wouldn't mind providing an explanation of this concept along with some overview, or a review of some of the considerations that accompany this topic.
Yeah, absolutely, Ben. Lowest net cost is maybe a subject matter that many of you have not been familiar with. So let me give the best explanation we can and try to make it as simple as possible. This is in a situation where a higher priced gross expense ratio fund may be more beneficial to participants in situations where revenue sharing is credited back to the participant. So there are situations in which a higher retail price share class net of revenue sharing is a lower cost than that of an institutional share class with 0 revenue sharing. And this example is at the bottom of the page, where we have a example of a retail share class fund at 70 basis points, revenue sharing of 35 basis points, in a situation where participants receive that revenue credit, again, that fee leveling idea, the net expense would be 35 basis points. Same fund, different share class, the institutional share class at 50 basis point expense ratio, no revenue sharing. The resulting expense ratio is 50 basis points. So in this situation, utilizing a higher gross expense ratio fund option would provide about a 30% decrease in participant fees being paid. Now, it's important to understand that this is not a widespread situation. There are a handful of opportunities in the marketplace where this does reside. But again, we're taking a look at mutual funds versus separate accounts or CITs. Separate accounts and CITs rarely have this situation, but certainly on the mutual fund side of the house, there are opportunities for lowest net cost investments. For those of you that don't know the intricacies of revenue sharing agreements and such, revenue sharing agreements are negotiated between a money manager or fund company and a record keeper. So depending on whether you're looking at proprietary investment products or non-proprietary, those revenue sharing agreements can differ. And that is especially situations where higher price share classes may get more value from a proprietary record keeper that's using their own funds. So Vin, if you go on to the next page and we take a look at some of the key considerations. So this concept of increasing the fund expense ratios in order to get a larger credit, it might be something you're scratching your head and saying, wow, do we really need to do this? Well, some of the things that you should consider when determining whether to go towards lowest net cost investments is number one, any fees associated with fund changes in communication. So with any fund change, you would have to, your record keeper would put together a project to make that fund change. And also the ability, also it's important to look at your own plan demographics to make sure that you feel comfortable that your participants will be able to understand this idea of lowest net cost, that we're going to charge you more expense ratio, you'll be getting a larger credit, so your net expenses are lower. So taking a look at your plan demographics and to determine if they make sense for this type of effort. Additionally, one of the things that we really want to make sure we think about is Form 5500. Carol alluded to this fact when she was looking at the ERISA lawsuits, that plaintiffs' attorneys have easy access to Form 5500s. And the 5500 won't go into detail of what you're doing with revenue sharing. So there may be instances where utilizing higher cost share classes may raise a red flag to plaintiffs' attorneys, which means that you would have to respond right to those requests for information, give them the information to say, we are using higher price share classes, but yet the net of revenue sharing, it's beneficial to participants. And last, but certainly not least, the last two items are that these arbitrage opportunities may go away over time. It is not set in stone what these revenue sharing agreements are. So a record keeper could simply change their methodology and eliminate this arbitrage opportunity, which means you would be probably go back to an institutional or lower cost share class. And finally, with any recommendation pertaining to potential risks of the plan, we always recommend that clients work with their ERISA counsel to determine whether this is the best methodology for you and your plan sponsors, or you and your participants. That's a critical component, but it's important to know about this concept and to evaluate your plan to determine if there are opportunities that you could seize.
All right. So thank you, Steve. Thank you, Carol. That was very helpful. We're mindful of time, so we're getting close to our allotted 30 minutes, but we did want to just spend a couple quick seconds. We thought we would conclude our discussion today with a summary of key actions for committee members to think about and consider. So at the top of that list for us is establish a fiduciary framework. You've heard that throughout the commentary from both Carol as well as Steve. You simply want to be sure that your committee's fee review process is consistent, it's comprehensive, it's well documented. If you do have a process that's all of those things, really the outcome should be twofold. One, you'll mitigate risk at the institutional level. And as important, perhaps more important, you'll be sure that you have a competitive program in place for your participants. The next piece you'll see on the screen, you want to make sure that you're understanding and evaluating all the different fee models that are available to the program, to participants, and make affirmative, again, documented decisions around how you allocate those fees and regularly revisit that. Benchmarking, obviously, determining reasonableness is paramount. So again, it's not to get the lowest fee per se, but to make sure you have some exercise in place where you're regularly monitoring and benchmarking fees. And then last but not least, staying well informed on marketplace trends, whether it's lowest net cost investments, or to Steve's point, all the different investment vehicles that might be available to you as a plan sponsor. It's important to stay on top of all those items. So again, we want to thank everyone for spending some time with us this afternoon. Hopefully you found the discussion informative and helpful. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to any of us directly. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.